25-year-old man who believed in nothing supernatural. He was rational and logical, always finding scientific explanations for phenomena. His friends, tired of his disbelief, challenged him one night. They told him of an abandoned house on the outskirts of town, said to be haunted by jinn. David, unafraid of such superstitions, accepted the challenge to spend a night there with a laugh. It was a dark and stormy night. David entered the house with his flashlight and backpack. As he stepped inside, his footsteps echoed in the absolute silence. He looked around the empty rooms, remembering how the townspeople feared approaching this house. David smiled and began to explore. Hours passed without incident. David decided to rest. He lay down in the least furnished room and closed his eyes. Suddenly, a soft, whispering voice woke him. The sound came from the room, but no one was there. David told himself it was just the wind whistling through the window cracks. But the whispers persisted. They were soft and continuous, as if someone was whispering in his ear. David felt the room's temperature dropping. He tried to convince himself it was all in his head, but when he looked at the wall, he saw shadows moving. Shadows without a light source. David stood up and approached the wall. He reached out towards the shadows and suddenly felt an intense chill. It was as if his hand had plunged into a refrigerator of mist and darkness. David recoiled, but he saw that the shadows were no longer confined to the wall. They were now floating in the air, slowly moving towards him. David looked for an escape, but every door he opened led to another room filled with moving shadows. He remembered his friend saying the house was haunted by jinn, but he still couldn't believe that what was happening was real. Suddenly, a raspy voice came from the darkness. David turned towards the sound in fear and saw a tall creature with red eyes and long, clawed hands standing in the corner of the room. The creature was staring at him with a terrifying smile and said in a voice that seemed to come from all directions, "David, you may not believe, but we have always been here." Now feeling terror in every fiber of his being, David ran to the window and threw himself at it with all his might. The glass shattered loudly, and he was thrown outside. But when he landed, he realized he was still inside the house. It was as if the house wouldn't let him go. David got up and searched for an escape again, but with every step he took, the shadows and the terrifying creature got closer. He screamed, and at that moment, another creature emerged from the shadows. This being, known as the Jinn Mazer, was larger and more terrifying than anything David had ever seen. Its skin was rough and black, and its eyes glowed like burning coals. Jinn Mazer spoke with a voice that seemed to rise from the depths of the earth. "Welcome to our home, David." David, now trapped between two terrifying beings, looked for a way to escape. He ran to the staircase and ascended to the upper floor. But with each step, the laughter of the jinn grew louder. When he reached the top of the stairs, he saw that the corridor stretched into infinity, and every door he opened led to a dark, cold room. In one of the rooms, David saw something he had never seen before. A large statue of Jinn Mazer that seemed to come to life with each glance. David couldn't look away. Suddenly the statue moved, and with a thunderous voice said, "You cannot escape us." David quickly left the room and ran towards the rooftop. When he got outside, he realized the house was surrounded by dark, stormy clouds. He went to the edge of the rooftop and looked down. Instead of the ground, there was only endless darkness. The laughter of the jinn was now coming from everywhere, and David, no longer able to bear it, shouted, "What do you want from me?" Jinn Mazer, now standing before him, replied with a deep and thunderous voice, "You have disrespected us, David. You laughed at our existence and denied our presence." David, now shaking with fear, said, I didn't know. Jin Mazur interrupted. "Ignorance is no excuse for disrespect, but we will give you a chance. If you can solve our riddle, we will let you go." David, now grasping at any hope for salvation, agreed. Jin Mazur smiled and said, "Our riddle is this: what always comes but never arrives." David, his mind warring with fear and anxiety, pondered. He remembered how he always sought logical answers, and now had to use that logic to save himself. He looked at Jin Mazur and with a trembling voice answered, "Tomorrow." Jin Mazur fell silent for a moment and then laughed deeply. "You have guessed correctly, but you still cannot leave." David, now feeling a sense of victory, asked in surprise, "Why? I solved your riddle." Jin Mazur's voice now carried a threat, "Because you still have another lesson to learn." At that moment, the walls of the house began to change. They turned black, and a sound like the whispers of thousands of voices emanated from them. David realized that the house was turning into a prison filled with jinn and dark spirits. He ran to another window and leaped with all his might. This time, instead of falling back into the house, he found himself in a dark, foggy forest. The sound of footsteps was getting closer and closer, and David knew the jinn were in pursuit. He started running, but the more he ran, the darker and foggier the forest became. Suddenly, a voice from behind him said, "David, you cannot escape your fate." When he looked back, David saw a being emerging from the mist. This time, it was a creature with white eyes devoid of pupils, with hands that reached the ground, and a voice that seemed to come from another world. He screamed, and at that moment, a creature with white, pupilless eyes approached him. David was looking for a way to escape, but the more he ran, the darker and foggier the forest became. The sound of the creature's footsteps continued to follow him. Suddenly, David came upon a river. Without hesitation, he jumped into the water. The water was cold, and its current was strong. David swam with all his might. When he reached the other shore, he found himself in a bright and peaceful place. He looked around and saw that he was in a beautiful garden. There was no sign of the dark forest or the terrifying creatures. David remembered how he had laughed at supernatural beings, and now understood that the world is full of mysteries and puzzles that he could never explain with logic. He looked up at the sky and smiled. Perhaps this experience was what he needed to gain a deeper understanding of the world around him. David never returned to the haunted house. He decided to start a new life, one in which he would search for meaning and the supernatural. And from then on, he never laughed at things he didn't understand.